On September 14, 2019, the humid morning air of Braxton County, West Virginia, carried an unusual silence through the dense Appalachian forests. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Thompson received what seemed like a routine welfare check call at 7:43 a.m. A concerned postal worker had reported finding mail accumulating at a remote property on Hollow Creek Road, deep in the mountains, where few people dared to venture. The property in question sat 15 miles from the nearest town of Sutton, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through thick woodland. Local records showed the land had been owned by the Whitaker family since 1942, but no one in the community could recall seeing any family members in decades. The elderly residents of Sutton spoke in whispers about the Whitakers, sharing fragmented stories passed down through generations about a family that had gone into the hills and never came back. As Deputy Thompson's patrol car bounced along the rutted road, the forest seemed to close in around him. The September temperature hovered around 78 degrees Fahrenheit, but the canopy of ancient oaks and maples created a perpetual twilight that made the air feel cooler. After 30 minutes of careful driving, he reached a rusted mailbox bearing the faded name Whitaker in hand-painted letters. What he discovered beyond that mailbox would shock the entire state of West Virginia and capture national attention for months to come. The deputy found himself at the edge of what appeared to be a settlement, frozen in time. 3 ramshackle structures, built from salvaged materials and weathered wood, sat in a clearing that had been carved from the wilderness decades earlier. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys, indicating recent human activity. The first person Deputy Thompson encountered was a woman who appeared to be in her 60s, though determining her exact age would prove challenging. She emerged from the largest structure wearing clothing that seemed to belong to another era entirely. Her hair was long and unkempt, her skin weathered by decades of outdoor living, and her eyes held a mixture of fear and confusion as she stared at the uniformed stranger. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Thompson with the Braxton County Sheriff's Department," he called out, maintaining his distance. "We received a welfare check request. Is everything all right here?" The woman's response was unlike anything the veteran officer had ever encountered. She spoke in a dialect so thick and archaic that he could barely understand her words. Her manner of speaking seemed to blend Appalachian mountain dialect with speech patterns that hadn't been heard in the region for generations. She appeared terrified of the patrol car, backing away and calling out to others inside the buildings. Within moments, more figures began to appear. Deputy Thompson counted 7 individuals in total, ranging from what appeared to be teenagers to elderly adults. Their physical appearances immediately raised concerns. Several showed signs of what medical professionals would later identify as genetic abnormalities consistent with prolonged inbreeding. Some had distinctive facial features, others showed signs of developmental disabilities, and their overall health appeared to be severely compromised. The family members clustered together, speaking among themselves in their distinctive dialect while keeping a wary distance from the deputy. They seemed to have no understanding of modern law enforcement, no recognition of official authority, and no comprehension of the world beyond their isolated hollow. When Deputy Thompson attempted to approach, they retreated like wild animals, disappearing into their makeshift homes and watching him through cracks in the walls. The settlement itself told a story of complete isolation from modern society. There were no power lines, no telephone poles, no modern conveniences of any kind. The family appeared to have been living entirely off the land, with evidence of hunting, gathering, and primitive agriculture. A small creek provided their water source, and they had constructed rudimentary shelters that showed decades of repairs and modifications, using whatever materials they could scavenge or fashion by hand. Deputy Thompson radioed for backup and contacted his supervisor, Sheriff David Hayes, who had served Braxton County for over 20 years. "Sheriff, you need to get out here," Thompson reported. "I've found something that doesn't make sense. There's a family living up here that looks like they haven't had contact with the outside world for decades, maybe longer." The implications of the discovery began to sink in as more law enforcement arrived at the scene. Social services were contacted, along with medical personnel and state investigators. The family's living conditions raised immediate concerns about welfare, health, and safety, but as the investigation deepened, authorities would uncover a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about human survival and isolation in modern America. The Whitaker family, as they would come to be known in the media, had apparently been living in complete isolation since the 1940s. 3 generations had been born, raised, and died in this remote hollow without any meaningful contact with the outside world. The younger members of the family had never seen a car, never encountered electricity, never experienced any aspect of modern life. They were living as their ancestors had centuries earlier, but in the 21st century. If you want to follow more cases like this, which shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The initial response to the Whitaker family discovery required careful coordination between multiple agencies. Sheriff Hayes recognized that this was no ordinary welfare check, and within hours of Deputy Thompson's radio call, the remote hollow was buzzing with activity. Social workers, medical personnel, state investigators, and even federal authorities converged on the property to assess the situation and determine the best course of action. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a social worker with 30 years of experience in rural Appalachia, was among the first specialists to arrive. She had dealt with cases of extreme poverty, neglect, and isolation before, but nothing had prepared her for what she encountered in that hollow. "In my entire career, I had never seen anything like this," she would later testify. "These people were living as if the modern world had never touched them." The family's reaction to the influx of strangers was one of terror and confusion. They had never seen so many people at once, never encountered vehicles beyond the occasional glimpse of aircraft overhead, and certainly never been approached by authorities. The eldest member of the group, a man who appeared to be in his 70s, seemed to serve as a patriarch of sorts. He was identified through fragmented records as Jeremiah Whitaker, though confirming identities would prove challenging due to the complete absence of documentation. Communication barriers immediately became apparent. The family spoke in a dialect that linguistic experts would later describe as frozen Appalachian English, preserving speech patterns and vocabulary that had largely disappeared from the region by the early 20th century. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a linguist from West Virginia University who was brought in to assist, explained that their manner of speaking was like hearing voices from the 1800s. Medical examinations revealed the devastating consequences of decades of isolation and inbreeding. Dr. James Morrison, the county's chief medical officer, conducted preliminary health assessments with extreme sensitivity, recognizing that these individuals had never undergone medical examination. The physical evidence of genetic abnormalities was undeniable. Several family members showed signs of intellectual disabilities, distinctive facial features consistent with inbreeding depression, and various health complications that had gone untreated for years. The investigation into the family's history required extensive archival research. County records showed that the original land purchase had been made by Ezekiel Whitaker in 1942. Ezekiel had been a widower with 3 children who had purchased the remote property and seemingly vanished from all official records shortly thereafter. No marriage licenses, birth certificates, death certificates, or any other documentation existed for the family from that point forward. Genealogical research painted a disturbing picture. Interviews with elderly residents of Sutton revealed fragmented memories and stories about the Whitaker family. Martha Collins, age 89, remembered her grandfather mentioning the mountain people who kept to themselves. According to local oral history, Ezekiel Whitaker had been suspicious of government authority and had moved his family into the mountains to avoid what he perceived as increasing intrusion into rural life. State investigators worked to piece together the family tree, though this proved incredibly challenging due to the apparent practice of intermarriage within the family. DNA testing would later confirm that the 7 individuals discovered were the result of multiple generations of inbreeding, with genetic relationships so complex that determining exact familial connections became nearly impossible. The living conditions documented by investigators told a story of incredible hardship and adaptation. The family had constructed their shelters using materials scavenged from the forest and occasional items that had been abandoned or discarded by hunters and hikers over the decades. They had no electricity, no running water, no modern sanitation facilities, and no access to medical care. They survived by hunting small game, gathering wild plants, and maintaining small plots where they grew basic vegetables. Child Protective Services faced an unprecedented challenge. Among the 7 family members were individuals who appeared to be minors, Though determining exact ages proved difficult, the younger members of the family had never attended school, never received vaccinations, never been seen by doctors, and had no concept of the outside world. They had been raised entirely within the confines of their isolated community, with their worldview shaped entirely by the limited knowledge and beliefs of their elders. Federal involvement came through the Department of Health and Human Services, which recognized the case as potentially representing the most extreme example of social isolation documented in modern American history. FBI agents were brought in to investigate potential criminal activity, though determining what laws might have been broken proved complex. The adults in the family appeared to be there voluntarily, and while the conditions were appalling by modern standards, establishing criminal negligence or abuse was complicated by the unique circumstances. The investigation also revealed the family's remarkable adaptation to their environment. Despite their isolation and the challenges posed by inbreeding, they had managed to survive for nearly 8 decades in one of the most challenging terrains in West Virginia. They had developed sophisticated knowledge of local plants, hunting techniques, and survival skills that impressed even experienced outdoorsmen among the investigating officers. Environmental scientists who studied the property found evidence of sustainable living practices that had allowed the family to maintain their existence without depleting the natural resources around them. They had managed their small plots carefully, practiced selective hunting, and had minimal impact on the broader ecosystem despite their decades of residence. As the investigation progressed into its second week, the true scope of the Whitaker family's isolation began to emerge through painstaking interviews and careful documentation. Dr. Harper, the linguist, had made significant progress in understanding their dialect and served as an informal translator between the family and authorities. Through her work, investigators began to piece together the incredible story of how this family had survived in complete isolation for 77 years. The patriarch Jeremiah Whitaker was revealed to be the grandson of the original Ezekiel Whitaker, who had purchased the land in 1942. Through fragmented stories and careful questioning, investigators learned that Ezekiel had been a deeply religious man who believed that the outside world was becoming increasingly corrupted. He had moved his family into the mountains with the intention of living according to what he believed were God's natural laws, free from government interference and modern corruption. The family's oral history, passed down through 3 generations, painted a picture of deliberate isolation that had gradually become involuntary imprisonment. Ezekiel had initially made occasional trips to town for supplies, but these had become increasingly rare as his suspicion of the outside world grew. By the 1950s, according to family accounts, he had stopped leaving the property entirely and had forbidden his children from having any contact with outsiders. DNA analysis conducted by the State Crime Laboratory confirmed investigators' worst fears about the extent of inbreeding within the family. Dr. Rebecca Stone, a geneticist brought in to analyze the results, explained that the genetic diversity within the family was so limited that it appeared multiple generations had been produced through unions between close relatives, including siblings and parent-child relationships. The genetic bottleneck was so severe that it represented one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding depression ever documented in humans. The revelation that shook investigators most profoundly came through interviews with the younger family members. A woman identified as Mary Whitaker, approximately 35 years old, had given birth to several children whose fathers were her own relatives. The pattern of interbreeding had become so normalized within the family that they appeared to have no understanding that such relationships were taboo in broader society. Their isolation had created a closed system where incestuous relationships had become the norm rather than the exception. Medical examinations revealed the devastating health consequences of this genetic isolation. Every member of the family showed signs of genetic abnormalities, ranging from intellectual disabilities to physical deformities. Several had conditions that would have been easily treatable with modern medical intervention, but had gone unaddressed for decades. The youngest members of the family, 2 teenagers, showed the most severe genetic abnormalities, suggesting that the effects of inbreeding had become more pronounced with each generation. Child Protective Services worker Janet Reynolds made a discovery that haunted her dreams for months afterward. Hidden in one of the family's shelters, she found crude graves marking the burial sites of family members who had died over the decades. The family had maintained these burial sites with primitive markers, and through careful questioning, investigators learned that at least 12 family members had died on the property over the years, including infants and children who had succumbed to conditions that would have been easily treatable in the outside world. The family's complete disconnect from modern society became apparent in countless small details documented by investigators. They had no understanding of money. Having operated entirely on a subsistence economy for decades, they had never seen electric lights, never used modern plumbing, never experienced motorized transportation. The younger members of the family had never seen other humans beyond their immediate relatives and had no concept that a world existed beyond their mountain hollow. Perhaps most tragically, investigators discovered that the family's isolation had not always been complete. Evidence suggested that over the years, hunters and hikers had occasionally encountered family members, but these encounters had been so brief and the family members' appearances so alarming that most people had simply assumed they were dealing with individuals with mental health issues and had not reported the encounters to authorities. The family's survival had required incredible resourcefulness and adaptation. They had developed their own methods for treating illness using local plants, had created tools from materials found in the forest, and had maintained a complex understanding of seasonal patterns that allowed them to gather sufficient food throughout the year. Women in the family had passed down knowledge of childbirth and infant care without any medical assistance, though the high infant mortality rate suggested that many children had not survived their early years. State investigators uncovered evidence that the family had maintained some awareness of the outside world through discarded items they had found over the years. They had collected magazines, newspapers, and other materials left behind by hunters and campers, though their limited literacy had prevented them from fully understanding the information these materials contained. They had a collection of items that created a bizarre time capsule of American culture spanning several decades, but their inability to contextualize these items had left them with a fractured and confusing understanding of the modern world. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe that all missing people deserve to be found, and that families like this deserve to be discovered and helped. The resolution of the Whitaker family case required unprecedented coordination between state and federal agencies, medical professionals, and social services. After 3 weeks of investigation, assessment, and careful planning, authorities faced the complex challenge of determining how to best serve a family that had existed outside of modern society for nearly 8 decades. The legal implications of the case proved extraordinarily complex. While the living conditions were appalling by contemporary standards, establishing criminal wrongdoing was challenging. The adults in the family appeared to be there voluntarily, and their isolation had been so complete that they had no understanding of available alternatives. Prosecutors ultimately determined that while the situation was tragic, criminal charges would not serve the best interests of the family members who needed help rather than punishment. Medical intervention became the immediate priority. All 7 family members were transported to Charleston Area Medical Center, where they underwent comprehensive health evaluations. The transition from their isolated mountain existence to a modern medical facility proved traumatic for the family. Dr. Morrison, who oversaw their care, described the experience as like trying to provide medical care to people from another century. The family members were terrified of medical equipment, had never experienced electric lighting, and were overwhelmed by the sounds and activities of a modern hospital. The youngest members of the family, identified as Rebecca, approximately 16, and Thomas, approximately 14, required the most intensive intervention. Both showed severe developmental delays and significant health issues related to genetic abnormalities. Their lack of education and socialization presented enormous challenges for social workers attempting to determine appropriate care options. They had never learned to read, had no understanding of modern technology, and possessed only the most basic communication skills. Social services faced an unprecedented situation in determining appropriate placements for the family members. Traditional foster care or group home settings were inadequate for individuals who had never experienced modern life. The state worked with specialized facilities that could provide intensive support for individuals with developmental disabilities, while also helping them adjust to contemporary society. The property in Braxton County was declared uninhabitable by health officials, and the structures were eventually demolished for safety reasons. The land remained in the family's ownership, but it was placed under state oversight to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. Environmental scientists conducted studies of the property to understand how the family had managed to survive for so long and to document the ecological impact of their presence. The case attracted national and international media attention, sparking debates about government oversight, individual freedom, and the responsibilities of society to intervene in situations of extreme isolation. Privacy advocates argued that the family had the right to live as they chose, while child welfare advocates emphasized the tragic consequences of allowing children to be raised in such conditions. Dr. Harper continued working with the family members for several months, helping them develop communication skills that would allow them to function in modern society. Her research on their dialect resulted in several academic papers that provided unique insights into language preservation and evolution in isolated communities. The family's speech patterns offered linguists a rare opportunity to study how language develops when cut off from broader cultural influences. Long-term outcomes for the family members varied significantly. The older adults struggled tremendously with adaptation to modern life and required permanent institutional care. Their physical and mental health issues, combined with their complete lack of familiarity with contemporary society, made independent living impossible. Several died within 2 years of their discovery, their bodies unable to adapt to the dramatic changes in their environment and lifestyle. The younger family members showed more capacity for adaptation, though their progress was slow and required intensive support. Rebecca and Thomas were placed in specialized residential facilities where they received education, medical care, and social skills training. Their intellectual disabilities resulting from generations of inbreeding limited their ability to fully integrate into society, but they made significant progress in basic life skills and communication. The case prompted changes in state policies regarding welfare checks and rural outreach programs. West Virginia implemented new protocols for investigating reports of isolated individuals or families, and social services expanded their efforts to identify and assist people living in extreme isolation. The state also increased funding for rural health programs and educational outreach to prevent similar situations from developing. Genetic counseling services were expanded throughout rural Appalachia following the case, as researchers recognized that isolated communities throughout the region might be at risk for similar problems. The Whitaker case served as a wake-up call about the potential consequences of geographic and social isolation in an increasingly connected world. The property where the family lived became the subject of academic study, with researchers from multiple disciplines examining the site to understand how the family had survived and what lessons could be learned about human adaptation and resilience. Their survival techniques, while tragic in their necessity, provided valuable insights into subsistence living and environmental adaptation. 5 years after their discovery, the surviving members of the Whitaker family continued to receive care and support. Their story serves as a reminder of the importance of community connections and the tragic consequences that can result when families become completely isolated from society. It also highlights the remarkable human capacity for survival, even under the most challenging circumstances. The case remains one of the most extreme examples of social isolation documented in modern American history. It challenged assumptions about individual freedom, parental rights, and government responsibility, while also demonstrating the devastating consequences of prolonged genetic isolation. The Whitaker family's 77-year separation from society created a unique window into human adaptation and survival, but at a terrible cost that continues to impact the surviving family members today. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth. Don't forget to like this video if it helped you understand this incredible case, and share it with someone who also appreciates true investigative stories. Subscribe to the channel for more cases that reveal the hidden truths of our society.